We're going to carry on now with the Reformation, and I pointed out last week I'd ended with Luther, and I had emphasized that although Luther signals a big transformation socially, especially the importance of having a Bible in every heart, so that every member of the spiritual community can be aware of what it is they really have faith in. And this is enormously important in the development of literacy. And it was very fortuitous, as I said, that the printing press of a movable type had just been invented around this time, so that worked out very well for Luther. But politically, Luther's support, as I mentioned, came from the principalities, and he didn't want to radically transform the political process. Now that is in comparison with Calvin, and again I think I mentioned last week that Calvinism is so important in terms of creating a new style of republic. It's a republic no longer of the Machiavellian sort where virtue was just energy and will, and the whole purpose of political involvement was glory and patriotism and such like. That's not what concerns Calvin at all. Calvin is still very much deeply embedded in the Christian tradition. Now, there were doctrinal disputations between the different evangelicals. The other important character is Zwingli. And they couldn't concur with Luther on doctrine. And ultimately, this will be very important. I won't go into the details of their theological disputations, but it is important to bear in mind that as Protestant communities start establishing themselves, and very often the lords and nobles of any kind of principalities had to basically take on board what the people were doing. They couldn't really afford to be against their bread and butter, which is exactly what the people were, their bread and butter, because that's where their resources came from, their taxation resources and the like. What was I going to say there? Oh yes. So that meant that often the Protestant communities, whether they were Calvinist or followers of Zwingli or followers of Luther, would often find themselves in conflict. It's very hard for us to imagine theological disputations taking on such importance. But if we look at, for example, disputations between Sunnis and Shias today, we can see there right before our eyes how significant it is that theological disputes or the role they play in dividing communities and in fact leading to violence. And there was a lot of violence in this time amongst the different communities. Now, Calvin himself was an extraordinary man, and I would just say as a theologian he's something of a genius. And his Institutes is an enormous work and enormously influential work. I would say that Calvin, along with Augustine, is really one of the most important shapers of history. In the case of Calvin, though, I would say that that importance really transcends his own particular preoccupations. That is, he, I think, and his community changed the nature of the state in such a way that it feeds into a much more democratic system which will eventually leave the theology behind and his doctrines behind. But without his presence, I don't think, and the influence of his community, I don't think, and his writings, that there would have been the development that took place in Europe and North America that owes so much to Calvin. So his Institutes of the Christian religion was to identify the institutional side as well as the theological grounding of the institutional side of life. Now, he was centered in Geneva, and that became a theocratic state. And one of the acts that occurred within Geneva that in many ways has plagued the reputation of Calvin, and there's lots of disputation about the extent of Calvin's involvement in this, but there was the burning of a heretic, and that was Michael Servetus, who'd made the mistake of visiting Geneva and He just got caught up in the machinations of that time. And in the traditional telling, I mean, one of the interesting things about the Protestant narrative, which also feeds into the Enlightenment narrative, is the idea that the church's persecution of their own, we recall the execution of Jan Hus, for example, that had been a big part of it demonstrating the demonic nature or diabolical character of the Catholic Church, because they did that kind of thing. But here we have the Puritans themselves doing this. I should also mention, a lot of people don't know this, that the witch hunt craze that took place in Europe, that was very much Protestant motivated. In the main, the Catholics didn't want to know about witches, and they just thought this was all kind of craziness. But that problem, of course, also translates or transfers over to America and the New World, where the Puritans have settled. And there's a fantastic play, you might be aware of it, which was a kind of analogy to what was going on in the 1950s with the anti-communist stuff that was going on. And that was presented as a kind of madness. And that's the play The Crucible by Arthur Miller. I strongly advise that you watch that. Now, Calvin's program of a Puritan state, in this respect, as I said, I think it has a huge impact upon the institutional and cultural mindset behind the political bodies, which will eventually become very secular. Though I do think, up until, and in fact I would say up until the election of Donald Trump, and those of you like Chris who've done international politics with me know that I do emphasize those Calvinist and Puritan foundations of the United States. Trump, as far as I can tell, is really the first president to, certainly in my lifetime, and if I go back to most of the 20th century, I'm less familiar with 19th century figures, but who didn't really present his narrative in terms of a Puritan kind of doctrine. Even when he discussed religion, and of course the big difference between the United States and Australia or Great Britain is in Great Britain or Australia, people keep their religion very private and it might actually count against you. But in the United States, being religious is very, very important still, because it simply has not undergone the kind of transformation, social transformation and religious transformation of the extent, against its foundations, of the extent that you find in Europe. So this idea of a Puritan state, let's roll back a bit and remember what I said about one of the things about the Protestants was it was an attack upon the idea of the church visible, the might and majesty of the church being something that you represented aesthetically. It's in the buildings, it's in the, and of course with the, you know, the burning of Notre Dame. That's a splendid example of the majesty of the church visible as in the Catholic world. And the majesty of the church visible is also a symptom of the fact that God's majesty could be represented. The Calvinists, much more so than the Lutherans, develop an aesthetic sense of everyday life. I think I mentioned this last week as well. But the churches, for example, there's nothing special about them. They just look like a dwelling. The walls are whitewashed. In fact, the whole idea is that this is to rule out the kind of idolatry that they saw taking place within the Catholic Church. Even unlike, as opposed to Lutheranism, even musical instruments were banned from the churches, and singing psalms was just done in plain chant. So that replaced hymns. The other important thing, which has a long lineage in the Christian tradition, but in the Middle Ages there is this kind of interpenetration of state and of church. And of course we recall Dante, or I hope you recall, Dante's argument against the popes and in favour of the emperor in the Gulf Ghibelline split and the various factions thereof that were taking place in, not only in Florence but in the Italian republics more generally. But this was, it tended to get just too close. So Calvin re-emphasizes that separation in office, but he also, because in many ways Geneva is a theocratic state, he also emphasizes that they must cooperate. The state is there for purely administrative purposes, but it should obey the church civil government, and it has to ensure that God is not blasphemed. Taverns will be closed under Calvin in Geneva. There's a very famous play of Shakespeare's Twelfth Night where he sends up the Puritans, where Sir Toby says to Malvolio, who is a Puritan and a figure of fun. Are you aware of that play? It's a great play. It's very funny. And at one point, Sir Toby, this drunken rascal, says to Malvolio, "Because thou art pure, thou thinkst there will be no more cakes and ale." So one of the problems I think the Puritans always had is, and this is a problem that the early Christians had, on the one hand, it does appeal to certain aspects of spirit, and especially against those that are sick of what they're seeing as Catholic oppression. On the other hand, it's very demanding morally of all those that are meant to be part of the community. And this idea of their own inner purity is bound up with the doctrine of predestination and election. Now, predestination simply means that God knows already who will be damned and who will be saved. And that's already been preordained. There's nothing that you can really do about that. On the other hand, so you think, well, if that's the case, then how can the Calvinists, why would they bother? And the point is that the Calvinists tend to see the world in such a way that you can actually observe at least some of the outer appearances of God's favour, but you need to be sceptical to be sure that there's a purity of heart behind the deed. So faith is still trumping works, but really what you do, how you live, should in some way register the inner purity that you carry. On the other hand, there's a hermeneutic of suspicion, to use a phrase of Paul Ricoeur, that's, I think, intrinsic to the Calvinist faith. And it's very much bound up with this idea, it might be one of these points I make here, that the community is basically involved in a kind of transparency. You're trying to be as transparent as possible with each other to signal the purity of your conviction, the faith that you have. Of course it is interior, but you're trying to shift the focus into the inner soul of what people are. So in a sense, I think much more so than the Catholic world, it is one in which a kind of surveillance within the Republic and the cultivation of this sense of self in devotion to God is so much more bound up with the actions of everyday life. And in fact, that's part of the big shift between Catholicism and the Reformers. It's the role you play in everyday life is the expression of your spirituality. It's also bound up with this idea of doing God's calling, your call. Again, all of these doctrines, you can find the seeds of them in previous Catholic theologians, especially in someone like Augustine. But you see, they take on an importance, a decisive importance, I think, in the working out of how the society is to be run that's very different. Don't forget also that as Europe has become reurbanized, as city-states have developed, there's more and more a breaking up of the feudal order. It hasn't disappeared by any means completely, but there are more and more urban centres, and hence more and more professionals. There's more lawyers, there's more doctors, there's more people serving each other within some profession, and the Protestant very much sees your profession as where you stand to serve God. That is what your calling is. Max Weber had even argued in a very famous work called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, that Calvinism is a seed of modern commercial society, and that the economic labour and acquisition is not contrary to Scripture, but idle money is a sin. Now, Weber's thesis has not been universally accepted, I should say that. And of course, as I pointed out last week, I think it was, that's because the Italian republics had already developed capitalism. They had already developed a banking system and ways of paying back investors, which was able to conform to the Catholic Church's idea of usury. When we consider Luther, for example, he's still very much against any kind of usury. But with the Calvinists, I think there is a definite emphasis upon work for God, grace motivating that, and commerce itself can be an expression of this. So there is zeal to illustrate the glory of God in your works based on your faith. Discipline is extremely important. And excommunication. And as I said, this is all very public. If you want to get a good sense of the Catholic world, I think, just look at the Philippines or South America. And look, it's kind of chaos, and then the sinner goes to church and gets forgiven. That's really not the way it works with the Calvinists. And again, a point I made last week is that very often there had to be a collective apology. Now, I've noticed in Australia how in the last 15 or 20 years, there's been a shift to public apologies when any public figure does something that's seen as mistaken. It's expected. And I think that this really comes out of the United States. And I think that is very much a very good example of the kind of Puritan consciousness. Now, albeit in a very secularized form, God has been replaced by moral ideas, which are very vapid things in my opinion. And when we look at Nietzsche, I'll give him a good run for his money to show why I think they're vapid. But nevertheless, that's tended to be replaced by, God has tended to be replaced by moral ideas. And later today, we'll see that shift towards deism, which is indicative of a seismic shift. I know Darcy and Chris have mentioned this in the other course, but I'll be repeating it. So, the elected council also should appoint people to have an eye on everyone and report on everyone. And again, I think, when the newspapers today or the TV is finding some idiot or poor bastard saying something racist on a tram or on a train or in a shop, and they focus and they, bring that to bear and then want some kind of public apology, because any sin you commit is against everybody, that's very much again the Puritan spirit, still very much in operation in our world. And that's not surprising, I think, in terms of the role that the United States plays, Puritan foundations, secularized Puritanism, the role that the United States plays in the circulation of public mores, public narratives, institutional authority of the authority of its institutions, especially in higher education, but also even its newspapers like the New York Times or something. These very often are seen as such bastions of rectitude and moral understanding, because those people that have been to the best schools, they've been trained in a certain way, and they participate in narratives that are of a sort that we can trust them, ostensibly. This is all very much a continuation of this. Children were to be instructed at home, but then examined by ministers. And politically, Calvin himself favoured a kind of mixed aristocracy. That is, it was a mixture of democracy. There was a democratic component to the aristocracy, but of course the aristocracy was no longer the old aristocracy. It was those elected souls, those of pure heart, those more spiritual kind of people. Taxes belonged to the community as a whole, and there was need for social welfare. Generally, and this is very important, it was anti-monarchical. And wherever you trace the development of Calvinism and Calvinist communities, you'll see that it was genuinely more Republican. Even someone like Rousseau, who is so important in the secular tradition, even though Rousseau did believe that societies needed some kind of religious anchorage, he emphasizes this, he sees himself as a good citizen of Geneva, and he acknowledges the importance of Calvin in his own thought, which was much more radical and much more secular, ultimately, than what we find in Calvin. So in the wake of Reformation, in the Reformation, the 16th century was very much a century of religious wars. And I mentioned Rabelais before. Gargantua and Pantagruel was his great work. I'll just mention him again briefly. He was a Catholic monk, I think a very anti-Christian figure, and he mocked all sides. And there's a very famous scene or a section in his work in which he has the chitterlings fighting, that is the sausages, fighting against the fish eaters. So the sausage eaters against the fish eaters. The sausage eaters, of course, being the Protestants, and the Catholics being the fish eaters, at least on fast days, which was holy days, Fridays, etc. And in the case of Rabelais, he moves much more to a line that's going to be compatible with Machiavelli broadly, if not in the specifics of the way he sees power. He's much more Platonist in some ways in how he sees power, much more classical. The Peace of Augsburg was an important decree, whose realm, his religion. That was a way to try and settle the conflict. It didn't really last. That was between Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the Lutherans, but that didn't really last. And there were all sorts of conflicts that still went on. One of the ones just worth mentioning very briefly was the St. Bartholomew's massacre in Paris, and that was followed by the expulsion of the Huguenots. And there, the Catholics just, Henry Nevers was going to get married, and this was an attempt to try and reconcile the two groupings, and the Catholics just hated this. And Navarre then was a Protestant. He would become king of the French, and he would renounce his Protestantism, thinking a kingdom was more important than his faith. What was also interesting about the St. Bartholomew's massacre was that the university in Paris played a very important role in orchestrating that massacre. And when we were speaking about the Middle Ages, I may have mentioned that the University of Paris was the central learning of education within Western Europe. St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, went there. Albert the Great went there. And this is all mocked, by the way, in Rabelais' Gargantua and Pantagruel. He mocks the university. And that was before the St. Bartholomew's massacre. There was the Edict of Nantes, was meant to be a kind of compromise. It didn't really take off. I've said that France was caught up in the religious wars through much of the 16th century. These religious wars, though not the only thing, but would be an important factor in the 30 Years' War. I'll just say this about the 30 Years' War, apart from the fact that it was an extremely bloody affair, and in parts of Central Europe, something like 2/3 of the population or 60% of the population were killed. It was horrific, and it was on a very large scale. Great Britain was able to be outside it, but it basically took place within the Holy Roman Empire, and France also got involved. But as the example of the French showed, because it often fought on the side of the Protestants, even though it was a Catholic nation, although the issue of the imperial forces wanting to retrieve the properties that had been taken by the Protestants, that was a big part of why the conflict existed. It wasn't the only thing. Now, the 30 Years' War, which ended in 1648, really set the stage for what we now call the modern nation state. It didn't really, it's not to be equated with the kind of nationalism that becomes ensconced with the French Revolution, where the nation is the people, but it did mean that there are territorial boundaries, and the monarchical or princely authorities, or if they're a republic, that the authorities of those areas had to be respected. And this was a big treaty and very important. Great Britain, though, had avoided the Reformation. I spoke about Henry VIII last week. But he didn't really solve the problem. I mentioned that Henry thought of himself as a theologian, but the Anglican Church was really the Church of Rome without any authority of Rome. So it was keeping a lot of the traditions, but there were a lot of reformers in Great Britain, especially in Scotland. And some of the upper classes who went over to Ireland were also Protestants, and that, in my lifetime, the problems going on in Northern Ireland are still very much a result of those kind of tensions that were never resolved. I will talk a little bit more about what goes on in the Three Kingdoms a bit later. Okay, that's essentially what I wanted to say about the Reformation, and I want to move on to the next period, the Scientific Revolution. And this is the seismic shift that takes place. This is enormous. So, to repeat myself, the Reformation was very important because it unleashed all these forces and new institutional configurations which created such a schism in Europe that the authority of the church now was not something universal in Western Europe. It had lost any claim to that kind of universality. But to quickly see the difference between the kind of world which emerges out of the scientific revolution, which is going to be extremely important when we get to the French Revolution and the role of the enlightened philosophes, the philosophers within that revolution, you will notice that the whole way of speaking about things has changed drastically. What is the all-important distinction? And it impacts upon how God is understood. It impacts upon the way we speak about the world. Now, I said this before, much earlier in the course, and I want to repeat it because I don't think this is often recognized sufficiently, even by people doing political theory courses. And I'll put it this way. When the classical philosophers wrote their work, in Greece, although people still spoke about the gods and appealed to the gods, when you read Greek literature and you read Greek history, you don't really see what we would call a religious world. But you do see that there's this conflict, as you'll recall, between Plato and the poets, between philosophy which tries to penetrate the ideas of things, the essence of things, or with Aristotle to identify the different classes of things and the different formations and structures of things. But they are a minority. And as Christendom develops in Western Europe, throughout the Roman Empire, when it's under Augustus it begins, and then with the falling of the empire or its movement to Byzantium, in the main, philosophy is not playing a very big role in anything. Medieval philosophy, of which there are a number of really interesting, great philosophers, Duns Scotus, Pierre Abelard, Thomas Aquinas, what they're disputing about is ultimately to do with the greater society as a whole and the role of the church within that society. It always comes back to that. So the cloister, the cross, Christendom itself is a ubiquitous presence that inflects the philosophy, and the philosophers themselves are a very small group within the greater social whole, and they have a very small influence within the society as a whole. Where things start to change is with the humanists, as I've said. But they are still very much caught up in the main. In the main, they're still caught up in the religious doctrines. So, when people put their world together, the way they see, the way they filter things, the way they talk, in a pre-philosophical or idiocratic, that is a society based upon the importance of ideas, in the pre-modern and pre-scientific age, they are really, they're using their imagination in a very figurative way. It's the figurative use of the imagination. What the scientific revolution, and it's not even the science that's so important, it's the metaphysics that accompanies the science, and the metaphysics, that is the philosophy that accompanies that, which tries to make sense of the world primarily in the first instance through science, and then it realizes that there's other aspects of life that are important, the moral, the ethical, and the third one that will come along will be the aesthetic. And that's good old Plato, isn't it? The good, the true, the beautiful. Or the true, the good, the beautiful. You can see that alignment straight away. But they emphasize the importance of the understanding. And why do they emphasize the importance of the understanding? And it can be summed up in one thing. They come out of the religious wars and they think the world has just gone mad. And the world has gone mad. People have been inflamed by their passions on the basis of their belief. And what real grounding is there for these beliefs? How true are they? To understand that, we need to free our imagination and subordinate, or free our imagination from the fiery images that engulf it, and step back, coolly observe things, and oversee the world through an understanding which will only draw upon the imagination to the extent it supports the understanding, not that it misleads. This, in the works of people like Descartes and Spinoza and a number of others, you see John Locke, you see Malebranche, a student of Descartes, we see this problem being chewed over and over again. And this is something I go into some elaborate length in a book that will be coming out towards the end of the year. Buy my book. It's going to be a bestseller, really. Joke. Okay, but it won't be. So Descartes had actually fought in the 30 Years' War. And there's a story of him having this moment of inspiration as he's seated by an oven to warm himself from that war. And Descartes always presented himself as a traditional Catholic because that was the faith of his birth, and yet he lived most of his life in Protestant countries because it was safer for him to do so. Now, let me just take it a step back from the metaphysics. There had been important developments in the sciences, and perhaps one of the most important, and usually when people speak about the scientific revolution, for example, Thomas Kuhn did a very famous book on the scientific revolution. It was a kind of bestseller in the 1970s, I think it was. It might have even been in the 60s. You go back to astronomy. And the big observations were about these planetary motions and the question that developed, and the big breakthrough came with Copernicus. He wasn't the first to say this, but it was central to him, and this idea just took off in a new way. And that was, he recognized that the sun doesn't revolve around the earth, but the earth around the sun. And this leads to what a good scholar on the scientific revolution, something of a philosopher, Alexander Koyré, calls the open universe. It's a picture of the universe as much more open. It's no longer earthly centric, as the Aristotelian system had been. Now, you recall that I pointed out when we discussed the Middle Ages that Aristotle's thought, through the importance of logic especially, had become central to the theological developments, even though he was a pagan, that had taken place within the universities, which were then still very much Christian institutions. Of course, once you've got the Reformation in Protestant areas, regions, that's no longer going to be the case at all. So the Aristotelians, in a sense, have been holding on grimly as the dominant, you could say, ideology or the hegemonic intellectual force within the universities. But the problem was that you had a number of astronomers who not only came up with a theory, but were making accurate predictions about planetary alignments that indicated there's something in this has to be true. Further, this was starting to be developed even further now, not just in terms of the planetary motions, but the idea of the behaviour of physical bodies generally. And there are a whole lot of important developments, but perhaps the most well-known is Galileo Galilei, who, living in Italy, was very interested in the study of projectiles. And this, of course, you could see that there's an economic and social rationale behind wanting to know how far something could fire. So what laws was this conforming to? And it was Galileo that really pulled the plug on Aristotle's theory of physics. And Aristotle's theory of physics had been receiving critical attention already, but it was Galileo who recognized that there's a law of falling bodies, and it doesn't matter whether the body is a feather or a rock or some huge entity, it will conform to a law, the speed of which has got nothing to do with the so-called lightness or heaviness of an object. Lightness and heaviness, which we use in everyday speech, was something that Aristotle thought was an intrinsic property of something, just as, the average person would tend to see that. But when you think of just bodies in motions, and you see wherever you would be in the universe that the same laws would apply to any kind of body, whether it's a person, a cat, a feather, or a projectile, it doesn't really matter. You start to recognize that there must be these laws of nature, and Aristotle goes a step further. In this, he actually takes inspiration from Plato and the Pythagoreans, but it's now configured in a laboratory kind of setting, and he uses his imagination in exactly the way that the metaphysicians of this new scientific worldview will approve of. That is, he does his little thought experiments. And these thought experiments are then meant to help him go and observe things taking place in nature so that you can identify the causal relationships, what causes what to happen, but you're using a matrix of law and, the point I wanted to make, mathematics, so you can quantify those laws. So everything becomes part of a kind of continuum. You no longer need to talk about, or should talk about, in fact it's misleading to talk about, what was called by Galileo himself secondary properties. The weight of something is a secondary property, whether it's damp or moist, hot or cold. These aren't things in themselves, they are indicative, they're symptoms of these other laws of motion taking place behind the immediate appearances that you're looking at. Underneath, That is, there's these inner bodily mechanisms in motion which are influencing things. And this is the great seismic shift. We call it the scientific revolution, but it's also a mechanical view of the world comes in. This is the idea, too, that the world is like a big clock. That's the metaphor that's often used for the mechanical revolution, or the mechanistic revolution. Now, you can see the behavior, or you should see the behavior of what a projectile does, or a falling body, and then you start to apply this also to planetary motions. You can see it's got absolutely nothing to do with logic. It's got nothing to do with it. You've got to observe it. Now this would be very important I'm going to skip a moment, because in many ways the scientific revolution reaches, in its mechanistic form, its high point in the teachings of Isaac Newton and his works on the principles of Mathematica. What is it? Anyway, and the thing that, of course, Newton discovered is, what's the great thing, where he brings all these things about swinging pendulums, falling projectiles, or projectiles in motion, falling bodies, planetary motion. They all come under one law. It's the law of gravity. It's the law of gravity. Okay. So there's these attractive forces. So, let's think of the law of gravity for a moment. What it means is, in a nutshell, if a speck of dust falls to the earth, it's obeying the law, but the dust is pulling on, that speck is pulling on the earth. Of course, it's such an insignificant amount that it doesn't matter really. But all you have is bodies being attracted and following some law. But again, the earth and the speck of dust, they're just points of view in a way. They're different masses that you're talking about, mass by acceleration. So, Newton, as I said, is at the end of the arc. The point I wanted to make is, that would lead to a very big disputation. Because what that meant was that you could have things operating upon each other at a distance. How could that be possible without some other bodily force influencing it? And people like Leibniz, who was the one exception who actually did try to reconcile physics and logic, but I won't go into that. Leibniz, by the way, is probably my favourite of all these philosophers. I'll just put that up on the table. His work is so beautiful. But he also invented the infinitesimal calculus, or discovered coterminously with Newton, though there's big disputes about who did it first, etc. But Newton said, look, you guys can argue about the logic of all this, but I'm just telling you, that's what happens. I've observed it. And I don't deal in hypotheses. That's just the way it is. In many ways, Newton, I think, represents the triumph of the empirical sciences over any kind of logic. Now, although Newton is without doubt the greatest of the mechanistic sciences, and it's only with Einstein that we see some radical advancement behind this view of the world as mechanistic in the physical sciences, the most important metaphysician, the most important philosopher, though not the most important scientist by any means, though he did make contributions in science, was a character called René Descartes. And I'm going to go to him now, and I'm just signaling now that when we speak about deism, that is that there is a creator God, but it's non-denominational, and there's no kind of figurative representation of this God, and there's no kind of mythic story surrounding this God. So it's got nothing really to do with the God that Calvin or Luther or Aquinas is talking about. This will become a really important component of what will be a transition from the reformist world to the more secularized world where atheism just becomes part and parcel of the currency of world making, or, which amounts to the same thing, in public life, the gods don't matter. It's only in your personal life you can believe what you like. But the real world that you will invoke if you go into a law court or if you're caught up in any kind of serious disputation within the public forum is one in which the understanding of things has to be presented. So that things have to be what they are, and they are not to conform to your religious predisposition. So let's look at deism a bit more closely. God is a being, source of creation goodness. We can find this kind of definition already in the scholastics, but as I said, the scholastics were doing this in a totally different environment. So it's only a small component of what is ultimately a whole set of reflections which end up being connected in some way to the Bible. In the main, there's some Neoplatonic developments amongst some of them, but in the main, that's the purpose to which it is used. God serves a metaphysical purpose, that is, the whole point of invoking this concept is to explain the world in such a way that order is everywhere and always there. That's the whole point of it. Note this, really note this. If you think, we're in Charles Darwin University, right? Okay, so let's just say we're all Darwinists. We all accept that Darwin is right. That the laws of nature have somehow evolved by chance. Now, the kind of mind that was around this time in the 18th century, they wouldn't have necessarily minded the idea that life evolves. I think that's absolutely compatible, even if the formulation and the moving into biology is a certain kind of intellectual advancement or scientific advancement. I think that's absolutely compatible with this metaphysics. But they would say, hang on, even to study these processes, you've got to make an assumption about the law existing, because surely the evolutions and adaptations that are taking place can only happen not because the laws evolve, but things evolve within the law. The cosmos must be a certain way, ordered a certain way, for that trajectory or adaptation, that development to occur. Because surely they had to comply with laws of nature. They couldn't have been beyond the laws of nature. So what is it that we're talking about when we're talking about laws of nature? So this is metaphysics, or playing with your head, but I think that is not an unreasonable question. And it's the kind of question which led metaphysicians of this period to want to find some way of stabilizing the laws, and God became either, as in Descartes, I think, a convenient term that you use to say the universe is law-governed, or actually in the case of Leibniz, who I think is in some way genuinely more theological, in some way, and Leibniz was a great conciliator of different positions. He wanted to basically combine ancient insights and modern insights, logic and physics. He wanted to show, look, it's all part of the one story. And it's always thought that's doing this. Or, in the case of Leibniz, God is there to create a pre-established harmony, and that harmony is required because he argues, and this is as much as I'll say about Leibniz, because I could just go on, and I love him. Because he argues that it's not just quantities that govern things, but quantities actually come back to a certain quality. And if you think about the infinitesimal calculus, I think that's why he says that. I think they fit together. Okay, that's as much as I'm going to say about him there. So, God, here I simply want to say, serves a metaphysical purpose. God, his existence, whether you're a Cartesian or a Leibnizian, Spinoza I'll talk about. Spinoza is somewhat different. Or a Lockean, God's existence is actually something that you discover with the mind. In this sense, here's the irony too. You're overturning the Aristotelian view of the universe and the Platonic view of the universe in many ways, but that's a very Greek move. That's a very non-Jewish, non-traditional Christian move to see the mind as capable of discovering the most important things. And then there will be all sorts of disputations. Does that mean that God is an innate idea? That's what Descartes says. He says, we couldn't really get that from just observing things, because that's, in a way, a precondition of the observation. That's innate. Obviously, prayer is going to be meaningful. Sacrificial relationships between God and person. There's nothing personal in any of this. And this philosophy at this stage is a very suprapersonal philosophy. And I'll come back to think about bodies in motion. From one way of looking at it is to say you're using the dead now to explain the living. The dead, the non-living things, which was, again, a real opposite of the kind of way that even Aristotle saw the world. What was also interesting was that this really was a way of uniting, this way of talking about God. It was ecumenical. It was a way of different philosophers who had been brought up in different faiths. Descartes was a Catholic, Leibniz a Lutheran, Locke, Newton were Anglicans. Spinoza had been born a Jew, but he was excommunicated. I'll just mention this one thing about Spinoza. Spinoza ultimately equates God and nature. He just brings them together. So, in that sense, that's often called, he can be called a pantheist, but he was seen by contemporaries of his as an atheist, and there was a very famous little tract doing the rounds, a secret tract called the Three Dogmatists, something like that title. It was a pamphlet, and it was very Spinozian, and it was an attack upon Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad. Now, Pascal, who was a scientist, and if any of you, there used to be a computing program, this is way, way back before you were born, called Pascal. And I remember seeing the computing books, that people were looking at in the 1980s, and it had, it was a particular system. Pascal was an important figure in the sciences. He did lots of experiments. In fact, he was probably a much more important figure, and he had worked on calculating machines, as had Leibniz, by the way. But he was an anti-deist. He was a scientist and an anti-deist. Because basically Pascal was saying, look, we live in this world of infinity, true, but the infinite silences in my own existence, in my own life, they frighten me. So where I take my orientation from as a human being has got nothing to do with the kind of work I'm doing on vacuums and gases and that kind of thing. That's something else. And there was a famous prayer he had stitched in his clothing. He was a Jansen, and the Jansenists were a rather ascetic. They were Catholic, but more Protestants in many ways, and they would eventually be banned in France. Fire, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, not the God of the philosophers and the scholars. And so that was very important. This will lead to, who I won't look in this course, but I have to say there's some very interesting modern thinkers, well, relatively modern things. One is called Johann Georg Hamann, H-A-M-A-N-N. Another is called Herder, who was a friend of Haman's, who have very much become influenced by the kind of emphases that people like Pascal had. So they're much more skeptical. Herd is more complex, but it's sort of between both camps. But much more of what is what we might call a hermeneutical tradition, a tradition of interpretation, which is, if you don't trust the understanding as much as these new philosophers do, and you say, look, we're always using the imagination, and really those that use the imagination figuratively saw the world in such a way that we might actually have something to learn from it and not just discount it as superstitious. Then you're looking at communities as collectives of shared experience in which they articulate those experiences a certain way, and we may have something to learn about the human condition by exploring that. Now, I said Descartes was born a Catholic, who was viciously attacked by the Aristotelians. He says, I conceal my teachings behind the mask. I am like a comic poet who advances upon the stage with a mask. I think that's absolutely true. Very often, in works on the history of philosophy, they treat Descartes as if he's somewhat of a traditionalist. I think this is wildly mistaken. I think there's all sorts of clues in Descartes where he indicates he wants to get the Aristotelians off his back because they dominate the universities, that he is teaching something radically new. And he said to a student of his who was basically, at that stage, a materialist, a guy called Regulus, saying, look, we must pour new wine into old bottles. The ideas are new, but we've got all these problems going on. I'm being attacked left, right and centre. So to some extent, let's use that language. Descartes will prove, for example, that that the soul is immortal. And he presents this to the scholastics at the University of Paris in a book called The Meditations, as if he's reconciling with them. The problem is he's equated the soul and the mind. And the mind in Descartes is nothing but a bundle of epistemic functions: imagination, understanding, will. So if that's what the mind is, what does it mean to say that that's immortal? Now you could see there's a kind of residue of the Platonic, because the Platonic view of the world, and indeed Aristotelian, had tended to see the soul in terms of its rationality or irrationality, and the rational would persist. But neither Plato or Aristotle are so reductive that it ends up just being a bundle of epistemic functions. But this is very important. I think Descartes is really fascinating as a historical figure and as a thinker. He sees all of nature being a machine. He makes it very clear that the purpose of life, or his philosophy, I should say, the purpose of his philosophy is to help people make things, discover things about nature, medicine especially, so that we might even put off the prospect of dying. The whole idea is to provide comfort. And the big thing is to find labour or devices that will ease us from the burdens of labour. This is really so transformative. That's why I'm including someone like Descartes in our modern, in a political theory course. Because although he doesn't really address politics at all, or just barely in passing, he basically says, if you're living in an old building and you want to live in a new one, you've got to wait till the new one is built before you leave the old one. And the building, of course, is you're moving between worlds. You want to make a new world, and you want to make a new world in which you can control the mechanics of nature because you understand its laws, you study its laws, you study what causes and effects come into play. He also emphasizes the difference between primary and secondary qualities, the mechanisms that you don't see. And in fact, he makes this very important point. You cannot trust the senses. The senses deceive you. Now, in saying that, he then makes this move, what's called the moment of radical doubt, or the hyperbolic doubt in Descartes. where he says you can't trust anything. But the one thing you can trust is that you're thinking. Because to say you can't trust anything is a thought. I think, therefore I am. So the self becomes the fulcrum upon which the world, and that was actually the name of a book of his that he didn't publish in his lifetime, the world can be re-pieced together according to a method that we can understand all the intricacies of the mechanics of its making. That is the radical shift that has taken place. Nature can be reduced to figure and number, and you may remember back in school doing analytic geometry, where you're able to see that a shape does actually have a number. That is of huge importance in development, and he is one of the pioneers in that. Nature is deceptive. I see the sun. It looks small in the sky, but that's not right. I'm yellow, but I've got jaundice, you know, all these kind of things. How to find certainty, that's where the certainty is, in my thinking. So we've got to step back. See, this is such a break. It's no longer a world of faith, of what you believe, or the rituals you participate in. All of that just goes. It evaporates in this way of thinking. That's just custom. And Descartes advises his readers, if you read the Discourse on Method, if any of you choose to write an essay on Descartes, be wary. He is saying one thing and doing another all the time. He presents himself as a very humble man. This is just my thoughts on this. And then, as you read on, he's really setting himself up to be a leader of an army of researchers. They're going to remake the world through proper procedure. Because, and another example, another metaphor he gives us is excellent. Summing up, I think, of Descartes. He says, imagine you're lost in a forest. Imagine you're lost in a forest. You've got no way of knowing how to get out. What do you do? And Descartes says, well, you've got to take a willful decision, but until you've got a good reason to believe otherwise, you choose a direction and you stick to it. And I think in many ways that is a fantastic metaphor for understanding how Descartes distinguishes himself from the kinds of philosophies that precede him, which he sees have just gone round and round and round in circles. They haven't really had a method to see the world. And Discourse on Method is the name of a book. He didn't publish it in Latin. It wasn't addressed to the scholars. It was addressed to ordinary people in the vernacular in the hope that this would popularize his thinking. And it did. It was very successful. Other philosophers, near contemporaries, they would dispute all sorts of the mechanics of Descartes' philosophy, or the minor points in Descartes' philosophy. But ultimately they shared a common commitment to the primacy of the understanding and seeing the world as a totally law-governed thing, as machine-like. That's why he's so important. I'll quickly run through some of the... Do you need a break? Will I keep... Or can I keep going? Finish a little earlier if I can. Okay, we'll keep plowing ahead. That's fantastic. That's what I love to see. Okay. So there's a metaphysics, but really the metaphysics is all about supporting the method. It's all about the way of framing the world and the self in such a way that we can make breakthroughs in our understanding of things. So, the decisive point about his method, and it's extraordinary how, in spite of all sorts of philosophical refutations of Descartes, and there's lots, and if you study the history of philosophy, you'll see that there's major philosophical schools take issue with Cartesianism. But this is still so commonplace, even the way the university thinks about the knowledge that it has as an institution and the way it makes reports are so heavily dependent upon this style of thinking, which is, as I said, it's philosophically deeply flawed. I'll just say that. It's deeply flawed. It's applicable to certain things, but it's taken off. Its success is such that even though we see all these other counterposing forces in the world, there are sites of social importance where this is just a dogma, where it's just treated as absolutely true. So, it's called the analytic and synthetic method. If you want to understand something, you have to break it down into its simplest parts, and then you have to be able to reconstitute it by adding the simplest parts. And if you realize you can't reconstitute it exactly, then you've missed something, so you go back and you take that step again. All relations form a series. We have to study all the gaps. You can see this is pure causal efficacy. You remember Aristotle's four causes? It's a complete break with that way of seeing things. He does say reality consists of two substances. When we look at Thomas Hobbes, a bit later today, he's very anti-Cartesian on this. Spinoza, who I mentioned, is very anti-Cartesian on this. But if you look at the way what he actually does, this decision to break the world down into two substances, that is mind and body, is simply a way to provide a metaphysical defense of the method. That's all it is. Because, as I said, the mind, one of the substances, the thinking ego, the self, is simply the epistemic functions, willing, sensing, imagining, and understanding. I forgot to mention sensing. That's all it is. That's what the mind is. It's not, but because he uses the language of substance, which was a typical Aristotelian trope, typical word of Aristotle, because he uses the word substance, that easily confused many of his critics and many other people into thinking, oh, he thinks there's something like, it's an entity. And in fact, in a work of his called The Passions of the Soul, he talks about the mind as if it has a physical location. So, and that's called the pineal gland. And he talks about the mind and acting on the body. But if you think through it with Descartes, what you realize is that's the materialist explanation of the mind. Now, I don't know if any of you study psychology, but it's very common in first year books of psychology for people to see a study of the brain, or to see a map of the brain, and this is the bit that does language, and this is the bit, I don't know, that watches television, or this is the bit that, does this bit and that bit, and you break it up like that. And I would just say that is absolutely Cartesian. And many think and teach, no, that's not Cartesian, that's material, that's post-Cartesian. No, that's Cartesian. Anything that is bodily, and it's only the body that has efficacy, that's caught up in a causal relationship with other things in the world, anything, which is why, as I said, he wants to provide a physicalist explanation of the mind and its operations, as opposed to the epistemic functions which are in play when you're just operating methodologically. And I think that, to be fair today, I applaud this. I think he's absolutely right. If I'm talking about method, how you approach something, it's no use me talking about this bit of the brain affecting that bit of the brain when I'm doing that. That's the wrong conversation. That's what another philosopher of the 20th century in a different context simply called, that's a category mistake. You're talking about this, don't go and confuse the water. You confuse the waters. So the good use of the imagination consists of construction of scientific models. I talked about some ideas, God and the soul, exist only in the mind. They're innate ideas. That's what he means by that. And body is defined as an extended substance. Leibniz, by the way, will completely disagree with this. Leibniz will say, no, 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 no. No, a body is the result of a force. There's some interior dynamic quality that makes a body be a body. And he uses the example of wax, of playing with wax and playing it. So really, I think Descartes' view of the world is a wax-like view of the world. It's a wax. So what do I mean by that? And this is why a whole lot of thinkers would emerge in the latter part of the 18th century and into the 19th century who really resisted and reacted to not only Descartes but Locke and Spinoza. Well, actually they use Spinoza in some way, but they reinterpret him. But they react to this view of life by introducing the concept of spirit into their work. The concept of spirit, which the mid-18th century French philosopher Montesquieu uses the word spirit too. And in some way he could be seen as something of a precursor, but only in some ways. And that group of thinkers is called the Romantics. You might have heard of them. And they argue that, look, you want to understand, and this is where Herder is often in this, a character I've mentioned before, and I will mention again when I talk about nationalism very briefly. The reason they mention this is because they see that you're never going to understand human behaviour, especially in its social development along these Cartesian lines or any post-Cartesian lines or any other mechanistic line. You just won't get it. What you have to look at is the different spirits of people, their myths, their stories, and that picks up again what I was saying about the figurative imagination and the understanding. They go back and realise there's something in this pre-modern way of doing business that still speaks to us, and we will be deprived of our humanity if we cannot connect in some way with that. Now, I say it like that, and I'm not sure what you think, but if I put it like this, I think you would immediately get it, and that is, are we really going to say that indigenous life was absolutely devoid of purpose and spirit and insight and intelligence about the world? We teach something called indigenous knowledges in this university. I think that is symptomatic of the fact there's also this anti-Cartesian spirit. I'll just say this generally. I do not think that the romantic and scientific kind of worldview that you've got in Descartes are very well conceived philosophically in public narrative at all. In fact, I listen to people talk where they slip from one to the other with such effortlessness, idiocy. I'm just astounded that they're not really taking any step to be more thoughtful and nuanced about how we can reconcile and what we're taking from each of these positions and come up with a more comprehensive or more thoughtful articulation of what's involved. So, he proves God exists, but God is purely a means of guaranteeing order. I've said this. Soul exists, nothing but functions. There's no miracles. There are no miracles. If nothing else, this is in the world. He says it explicitly. Anyone who understood Descartes' philosophy would have seen that even if they had never read that in that book, which was published posthumously, they should have known that. It's a whole philosophy requires that you think that. There's only laws and law governing. And this would be, again, a hugely important set of philosophical debates occurring through the 18th century about the nature of miracles. Now, again, let's look at the pre-philosophical, non-philosophical worlds of Christendom and Judaism, and something Islam too. You'd say the world is nothing but miracle. It's one miracle after another. It's a miracle. It's a miracle that you're listening to me. You mightn't think of it. It's a miracle that you're listening to me. It's a miracle that your parents met each other. It's a miracle that their parents and their parents, and there's one miracle after another. that the world is this great big mystery, and a better way to talk about it in terms of the meaning it has for us, note that once you talk about life, the meaning it has for you, as opposed to life and the mechanics of how it works, you're really caught up in a very different kind of conversation. And so ultimately, I think those that are interested in philosophy, there's some point at which they're going to say, what am I really interested in? What kind of questions really stir me to want to participate in the broader conversation? So this is a determined view. Interestingly, though, unlike Spinoza, for example, says there's no freedom. Leibniz also says there's no freedom. Descartes says, oh no, there is a kind of freedom, and that's because we speak. That's because we speak. That is very interesting. And the will can affirm or deny something at the level of speech. But when it comes to... But he doesn't really do much with this. In fact, that kind of suits the dualism of the two substances, but one of which, of course, as we said, is purely epistemic functions. Okay, I said that about the passions of the soul. The question for many of his contemporaries was it deterministic enough? Spinoza and Hobbes thought no. His system was rejected because for the Newtonian reasons I mentioned before. But he does provide this metaphysical language. There's no ethics yet. So, Descartes does, in the Principles of Philosophy, one of his early books, he likens philosophy to a tree, the roots of which are metaphysics. So this needs to be, so the metaphysics is important, that frames it. But he did say, I think it's to Elizabeth, he was instructing her. Queen Elizabeth in Sweden, and he dies. He dies because he had to get up early in the morning, and he got a chill and killed him. And he was a guy that used to like sleeping in bed till about midday, and he'd be thinking about things. Anyway, he said to her, or someone else, he said to her, I spend nearly all my working day working on problems of physics. And I spend a couple of hours a year thinking about metaphysics. That's really important, because you see, the metaphysics is there to serve the physics. As philosophy develops, that is, after that, other philosophers come along and start thinking, oh no, it's not like that. The questions, there's too many questions ruled out for thinking this way. So you've got the metaphysics of physics and then the branches, and the branches include ethics. So in that way, and the various sciences, mechanics, medicine, in that way, I don't think this distinction is as strong as someone like Spinoza thought. By the way, Spinoza begins his philosophical life as a very ardent disciple of Descartes. You know, he thinks this is really great. And then he starts to recognize in the metaphysics little things he wants to improve upon. It is not surprising, and already this is taking place with Spinoza, religion then will be seen, as it is by the Enlightenment figures generally, as nothing but a moral teaching. As I said, eventually they'll realize art. But so there you have it. You have world, physical world, morals, aesthetics. Now, aesthetics won't play such a big role for us, so it'll come back when we look at Nietzsche, even though it starts to evolve as an important discipline prior to that. But morals, when we talk about Immanuel Kant, and even in John Locke, who we'll be talking about, morals does play an important part. But what is it exactly? Is it going to be something like Spinoza has? Or is it going to be something in which humanity asserts its freedom over and above the world of the mechanical bodies within which it's called. So this really, we could say, the whole Enlightenment program is really out there in Descartes and these very near contemporaries of his, usually slightly younger than him, who come along and interact with his system, finesse it. But the paradigm is there. That's the important thing, the paradigm. Not the particulars. Not the agreement about every part of the metaphysics or every argument. But it's the overall frame of reference. You can see, to repeat, the kinds of things that Calvin and Luther and Augustine, that's all gone. We now really leave the Christian world more or less behind. And when Nietzsche will say God is dead in the 19th century, he will say God has been a metaphysical issue, and modern science, modern metaphysics is a big reason for its death. So let's look at the liberal term. I'm going to talk about Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. Both of them were caught up in all sorts of metaphysical disputes. Both of them are critics of Descartes. Locke is also a critic of Hobbes, but his criticism of Hobbes is primarily directed at the social and political. Hobbes, when we look at him, his view of the social and political, it begins with this very radical movement. So Hobbes does say about Spinoza, I don't go into Spinoza's political thought here, but Spinoza was also one of the first people to advocate modern democracy. And the reason he advocated it, just to underscore one point of why it's important, is because he believed that the new science needed to be institutionally protected. So you needed to allow for freedom of speech, even though his own thinking is in many ways so mechanistic, whereas freedom. In fact, this is one of the great paradoxes of modern thought and its foundational forms, is that generally there's a consensus about the universe being deterministic, but when it comes to human life, the big question of freedom and then equality become the pillars which start to be so decisive in dictating the terms of ultimate appeal of the moderns. I'll just quote this: government has no other purpose, no other end but the preservation of property. Just keep that in mind when we get to Locke. But we will talk about Hobbes. Now you'll notice here that's a sovereign, that's a king, and you notice this, all these people are making up the metal of the armour that this king is wearing, that this ruler is wearing. So we'll clarify that. So, that's when we look at Hobbes, I started to say it and I got subdued again. It's a very mechanistic picture of human life. Now, I do want to take it back before I go on to them, because they are considered, Locke unequivocally, Hobbes more in a qualified way, and we'll see why there's that qualification, and the reasons for the qualification are very strong. But some of his thinking does fit into a liberal ethos, but ultimately where he takes the state and how he conceives it doesn't. But the way he puts the argument together is very liberal. But let's go back to liberalism as a force of life rather than just a doctrine. And it only really becomes a doctrine, although we can say Locke or Hobbes and Locke, and definitely Locke, are the first representatives of liberalism. Liberalism as a term only really takes off in the 18th century. That's when you start to divide the world into ideologies and isms. That hadn't been done then. Now, unlike Marxism, liberalism in many ways is a reality before it's theorized. It's a reality. It's part of a social reality. Or that's a bit too strong. We'll just say there's certain features of the world that are in play which are so socially significant and which also have a history which then enter into the kind of framework of the theory of the kind of world that people want to make. But there's already liberal features of that world up to a point in place. Okay. Now, when we go back and we look at some of these roots of liberalism, we're not for a moment ruling out the bleeding obvious, which is this is primarily a feudal world or world of urban centres breaking apart the feudal world order. But there are certain events that take place within this world which ultimately become such a part of the mindset of people, even though there's all these other aspects of it which is still very much a religious worldview. Okay. But some of it is straight out political, and the Magna Carta is a very good example of that. So this is from the Magna Carta. King John had basically, the context is, King John had been caught up, and this has been going on for a little while in England, in wanting to centralise the state. And therefore, neglecting any sense of duty and obligation to those that gave him ultimately his power, which are the lords that are surrounding him. And that's, of course, the way the feudal system works, as we had mentioned before. So we have granted also and given to all of the freemen of our realm, for us and our heirs forever, these liberties underwritten, to have and to hold them, and the heirs of us and the heirs forever. That is a recognition that there are certain liberties that are inviolable, and as Edmund Burke will come up with this very felicitous formulation many centuries later. He's a contemporary of the French Revolution, Edmund Burke, often considered to be the founder of conservative thought. He says, what the basic rights and freedom have existed in England since time out of mind. Note this, they exist forever, and they always existed. So the lords were demanding, and this is very interesting and very significant, that there was an understanding that rights and obligations were so invariably connected that if you had played your role, then the king could not just exert prerogative power and come and steal your stuff. And that's very much why they held a sword to his throat and threatened to do him. Another feature, so rights, that's one aspect of the liberal tradition, and rights, a big chunk of this, we can find in the Magna Carta. We find it in various other locations as well. I just want to point that out in the case. The rule of law. Remember, going back to a point I made much earlier, that within the Middle Ages, through a whole set of developments, herbal, the manorial law, ecclesiastical law, there had been a proliferation of legal domains. Feudal laws, mercantile laws, etc. Royal law. A whole set of proliferating domains. So the idea of the rule of law, which is central to liberalism, wherever these occurred, and this meant sometimes this played out very well for the peasantry, for example, because if they could escape from this lord, where they are under imposition of feudal law, and move into a centre where there was urban law, they'd be protected. Or members of the church, they couldn't be tried by members of the crown, by the crown. They had to be dealt with under canon law. Then there was rights, rule of law, and representative institutions. And the parliaments go back in England to 1258 at least, and the Parlement, which is really a legal, very often the Parlement, say in France, but elsewhere, you had these bodies that had some kind of legislative role of appeal. So they very closely work in relationship to law, and indeed the liberal system, I think rights, law and representation are the real bulwarks of the actualization of liberalism. So, and there are complex reasons for that, but this is something I've stressed so often in the other course I'm teaching with Chris and Darcy. One of the things that is so frustrating is to see how it's a kind of knee-jerk reaction now to take this 19th, 20th century view of politics as there's always oppressor and oppressed. What this is indicative of is it really was much more complex than that. That there was a mutual set of reciprocity and bonds and obligations. That the world was the way it was, and although, yes, of course there were winners and losers, but people forget that the winners in the feudal ages were the very people that had to go and die and had to do battle. That's a pretty big sacrificial expectation. And this comes back to something I've used this term right at the beginning of the course. The idea of society is built upon sacrificial roles and obligations. It's a sacrificial core at the center of society, which the ancients all recognized and which as the modern develops, and especially as liberalism and then socialism take off, all of this kind of speech tends to get neglected, and it gets neglected absolutely coterminously with what I think is the great danger of the modern mind. And that is this huge ignorance that comes from not knowing how we got to be where we are. It's a very, very serious problem. Trade and liberty. That is the way in which they work together. Now, the Hanseatic League and Italian city-states, such as Florence and Venice, were very good examples of trade taking off. But it's only really when trade has reached a certain level of social importance, again, that the rights representation, the rule of law, and then property all start to come together. The other thing that's very important, which simply arises out of the feudal system itself, it's a kind of unintended consequence, is the way in which the society was a huge tapestry of contracts. You know, this is astonishing. When we get to Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, the three great social contract theorists, every one of them reimagines the world to fit a theory that they have about human beings. They all appeal to some foundational contract. And the question that is rarely asked is, why do they make that move? And you'd have to say, well, because coming out of Europe, that was the most basic kind of pact that had existed in the forms of social, apart from sheer force. But when there's any kind of social collective cooperation, then contract comes into play. The need for tolerance would arrive, and John Locke writes a very famous letter on tolerance, and that is an important part of the liberal ethos, and that comes out of the religious wars. And then there's just that philosophical stuff that I spent so long talking about. It's a secular way to put the picture together. Now, really interesting, if you read John Locke, if any of you write an essay on him, in his two treatises on government, there's Treatise 1 and Treatise 2. I always concentrate on the second treatise, as does pretty well everyone who teaches political theory,
because that is the argument for liberalism. But the first one, the first book, deals with a character called Robert Filmer, who's using biblical argument to justify monarchical authority. What is interesting is Locke is quite happy to play that game, but you know when you reach the second treatise that really he's thinking about the social and political. It's not really biblically based at all. It's not based upon the figurative understanding, which is what Filmer is drawing upon. It is figurative imagination, sorry. It is based upon an understanding in which he wants to understand the nature of things and the basic processes of things as they are and can be recognized by the mind to be. So, again, the humanists were important. So you see now all these bits of liberalism. Liberalism is requisite upon all these things having evolved. And I want to stress again, when we come to Marxism, what we see is something that is from ground zero up. When we look at liberal theory, as in Locke, it often makes a case as if it's from ground zero up. But it's not. That is, it's drawing upon all these things already largely in operation. So its job, and in fact this gives rise to a bifurcation, you could say, that exists within the liberal tradition, which is very important. So this big division. And that is, one lot of liberal thinkers, because of the way they speak about things, it has what I think is a very pernicious unintended consequence. That is, they tend to see everything as constructed by their own mind, so that you could then go and transpose a liberal order into any kind of social formation that's already there. And this was exactly the kind of thinking that the neoconservatives undertook or pushed for with the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, or the liberate, whatever you want to call it. I don't want to get caught up in the nomenclature. But you can see they've got a model and they impose a model. That is much closer to Marxism. But, and that's also why liberalism in Europe is a very different kind of affair because of the actual social structures that are already in place, and the liberals then come along and accentuate these aspects of existence that are already there and appeal to the players operating from out of those conditions and appeal to a way of thinking which makes these align better. So it's an alignment issue. Whereas, again, the Marxists, every bit is ultimately requiring from the ground up. Even though when we look at Marx, which some of you have just done, but I'll be repeating some of that, you'll see that he also sees something of things already in evolution, but there's serious issues to be had with what he takes out. But here you have, as I said, big chunks of social experience there. The other line of liberalism, the second one, I said it's bifurcated, that's really represented by someone like Montesquieu rather than either Locke or Hobbes. Just bear that in mind when I talk about Montesquieu, because that factors in real history as opposed to mythical history of the sort that Hobbes and Locke come up with. Even though, to be fair to both, well, I'm not sure if it's fair or chastising them, their mythical history actually, you can see its connection to certain features of their immediate experience, but they deny the historicity of what they're invoking. And this leads to a serious problem because, in fact, I think both Hobbes and Locke say some things that are very true, but because of the way they've set up the issue, they're speaking, to use a term of Spinoza, as if we're subspecies eterni. So if we're always existing, and this is absolutely what must happen, had happened, when it happened under certain conditions And you should go off and explore those conditions to have a better historical understanding of why that had happened. So, in many ways, liberalism, you could say, it really takes off in Britain. And it is, as a theory now, as a serious theory in which all these components start to, which are, as I said, in existence, start to figure in a better kind of theoretical understanding for coming up with a political understanding or an understanding of political life. It's very much the outgrowth of the English Civil War. And in the first instance, although the divine right of kings had not been completely without lots of qualifications, even though you could say, oh, St. Paul, you know, the rulers have been ordained by God. But there's all sorts of other things that complicate that picture within the Christian understanding of rulership. It is true that in parts of Europe, this was happening in France and it was happening in Great Britain, this idea of the divine right of kings had really taken off. And the writings of Jean Bodin in France were very important and decisive. I won't go into his thought. Yes, I'll just say this, that this doctrine also, due to territorial conflicts, papal states, the Reformation and religious wars, had led to states becoming increasingly dissociated from the church. So in some ways, this doctrine was really hanging upon rather thin threads. But by the 17th century, the English crown is claiming this divine. It's one of these unfortunate things. You're claiming something because that's really the way it looks right now, but really you've missed the bus. It's just not like that. And this is Filmer. I mentioned that he would defend the divine right of kings by this biblical set of arguments. Let's just quickly go through, I had mentioned the importance of Puritanism in England, and Henry VIII divorcing from Rome, or divorcing the church from Rome, taking over church property is exactly as had happened in the reformist communities and nations, but the problems but his failure to deal with the reform, not knowing, and Elizabeth is exactly the same. They're not quite sure what to do. Persecuting the Jesuits that are still playing their part, at times heavily persecuting the reformers as well. So saddled with the Church of England, which doesn't have real populist support. And then it's plagued also by its geopolitical, in terms of Ireland and Scotland. First of all, Ireland was Catholic, but James had undertaken, James I, systematic program whereby Protestants took Catholic land. That was a huge problem. So there were uprisings in Ireland. Scotland had been populated by the Calvinists, or the Calvinism had spread up there, and the Presbyterianism is really just Scottish Calvinism. And the Scottish reform had been very strong. Now, see, there's another thing, of course, is it's really hard at this time to police all these communities. You don't send telegrams to people and, just getting around. Keeping control of things is difficult. And especially if you're also caught up in wars in Ireland. So they had moved decisively away from church. So in the main, the Crown was caught up with wanting to stop Catholicism. There had been the Gunpowder Plot in 1605 by the Catholics, Guy Fawkes. But the Puritans have been expanding, and this included many personal landowners. So one of the things, as I said about the Calvinists, they tended to be professional and wealthy, and/or wealthy. And this, so it spread also into the rural community, but at the top level, to the gentry. Now, Henry VIII had, in a sense, created this problem because he had given a lot of church land to his supporters, who were often cutthroat thieves, really. Thieves now dressed up as lord and gentry. But a couple of generations later, they're feeling the pinch of excessive taxation, and they've drifted religiously away from Anglicanism, which is seen as just propping up this monarchical authority, which they feel doesn't represent their interests. Now, Charles I had married a Catholic, tried to impose Anglican prayer books on the Scots, which caused rebellion there. Every time we study revolutions, what do you know? You know one thing, don't you? And that is the biggest problem facing the crown is getting its hands on money to feed the army. This is a recurrent problem because without an army, you're done. And this was the problem that Charles had faced as well. So he's fighting in conflicts in Ireland, conflicts in Scotland, and he needs money, and there's conflicts elsewhere as well. Okay, there's a ceasefire, but ultimately it's a class war. This is oversimplified, but the class and religion are bound together. And when I say it's a class war, it's basically the gentry are, it's not the masses. You know, it's not ordinary people that are interested in this. They're going to be taxed by whoever. It's really coming from these elites, as is always the case. You know, political rebellion is always, again stressing the other subject, it's always a disputation between elites over who should rule, who has the right to tax, who gets paid, who doesn't get paid, how much do they get paid. Cromwell would become Lord Protector. England would even become a republic, but it didn't last. It just wasn't able to support any of these new social structures. This is why Montesquieu in the 18th century will write. He will warn the French crown that if they don't devolve some of the powers, and not only the crown, but the two leading other estates, the upper clergy and the nobility, if they don't devolve some of their rights and privileges, they're going to be in trouble. But he will also warn those who are going to be the rebels that when you think you get rid of them, you're going to find there's all these sorts of social issues that you hadn't realised are being managed by those classes, which is outside of your whole scale of experience. So that's incredibly insightful, and this is, I think, exactly what happened in Britain. So there's problems about, you know, Catholicism, and there's problems about succession, and so there is a restoration, and eventually the Dutch are invited to come and invade England. Basically, it's small enough group. And William of Orange is set up, and this is called the Glorious Restoration. And the Bill of Rights, which appears in 1687 or 1688, and that's when Locke writes his second treatise of government. So the background to this, in terms of Hobbes and Locke, is basically Hobbes is writing at this period, in the high point of the Civil War, and this is the end of the Civil War. It's ended a couple of generations earlier, almost a couple of generations earlier, but the outcome is now sealed. It's sealed by having a constitutional monarchy. You now have the gentry having genuine political representation, able to articulate their interests, which is what they wanted, but then finding agreement amongst themselves is a problem. This way, the monarch becomes the seal of the legislature. It becomes a final body of authorization, but it doesn't present the legislation. It's, in fact, it becomes a kind of win-win. The old world doesn't go, but this is still very far from being a modern democracy, but land and property and representation are now being ensconced. And it's called a restoration. Glorious restoration. Restoration. That means you're restoring something. What does that remind you of what I spoke of earlier? What is being restored? What could the ancient appeal be to? Magna Carta. Which is appealing to time out of mind. Okay. They're both reacting to the Civil War. They both tend to universalize the experience of England. Both make a new kind of argument about government. Along with Machiavelli, they can be said to be the founders of modern political science. They both believe they have a scientific understanding of the world and of political obligation and political authority. Hobbes is illiberal insofar as we see that the sovereign takes on absolute authority. At the end of the day, he doesn't really care whether the sovereign is the Parliament, and he writes a book on the long Parliament called Behemoth, which is a biblical monster, and he writes the other book, Leviathan, which is another biblical monster. You get the picture of what he sees the state is. An absolute monster. An absolute monster because people are fundamentally monstrous. That becomes really, I think that's really central to his thinking. In a different way to Machiavelli, but in some ways it matches up with Machiavelli. But he does see the sovereign, and this is the liberal bit, he doesn't see the role of the sovereign as dictating the absolute good to which people should conform their lives. So in this sense, although you could say he's authoritarian, when we look at modern totalitarian kinds of states, authoritarian states, he's not like that. He's much more like Singapore would be a good example of his kind of authoritarianism. That is, there's certain things they are really forbidden, but live within those parameters, I don't care. But you don't have to conform to any ideology. This is politics. This is serious stuff. You go off and do the other stuff with your mind, and whether you want to grow grass, cut grass, smoke grass, that's your thing. As long as it's legal. That's a simplistic formulation of liberalism, but that's kind of true. Locke, on the other hand, does provide a very full-blown, explicitly full-blown theory of liberalism. Okay, this is the last slide that I'll talk about today. So I can be now on track after next week. I'll be a little bit behind, but I'll be sufficiently on track to be really on track for the last bit of the course. Not next week. When we return, I keep making. I can't turn up. I'm going to be in Brisbane. Okay. Hobbes is often considered to be a political realist. So in international relations theory, you go to Thucydides, the great historian of the Peloponnesian Wars, then you jump to Machiavelli, then you go to Hobbes there, the three founders of realism. I have to say, one of the reasons Hobbes is so important is he recognizes something fundamentally true. And if he hadn't set his picture of the world up in the way he does, you could give all sorts of examples, and his obvious example is the Civil War itself, but you could give all sorts of other examples which show that when you have a breakdown of sovereignty, it's chaos. It's horrible. And when you look at failed states, That's where you can see the truth of Hobbes. Just as I would say when we look at Locke, when you see successful commercial states, that's where you can see the truth of Locke. So they're both, I think, tapping into something that's true. I do have problems with both of them about the way they found it, because I think this is mythical in a bad way. Now, the first thing about Hobbes is he basically looks at people as if they're appetitive machines. Scientific revolution. You know, he's just, that's all we are. We're appetites in motion. And that also leads him to have a very atomized, which is also very liberal, a very atomized view of society. He's not looking at it in terms of cultures and cultural collectives and those kind of things. So when it comes to religion, you can see he has to invoke that. But theoretically, that just seems sort of grabbed out of thin air. Well, it's not grabbed out. It's in the reality. It's the theory that's deficient. But this atomization of social reality does come at a heavy cost. Let me warn you, and this is why liberal societies, or one reason why liberal societies find themselves in all sorts of problems, because there's a very false view at work in how it views things. Now, if I link to what's going on in our world now, identity politics is one way to try and get around this. It's a way of gathering groupings. But I think there's a serious problem with that as well. And that is, I think it's based upon, and I'll put my cards on the table here, I don't care if this is not a popular view, but it's true. And the truth is, it's a philosophical truth, it's just absolutely fact. And that is, people are not essences. People are not essences. They're not defined by one sole exclusive feature that emanates from them. And in fact, you do have occasions where states try to implement that through definition, and both communist states did it through class, and fascist states did it through race. And you see what kind of hell they created. I think there is something that's just true. Your lies or your deceptions or your myths that don't, and I'm not talking about the figurative use of the imagination, which may actually disclose something very fundamentally true, but in a mythic way, but a myth which rests upon nothing but a vapid idea which really lacks substantiality is a very... Reality doesn't like to be ignored. It comes back like a monster at people. The most valuable thing about studying ideas and history itself is that it can instruct you about the way people frequently, including ourselves, miss things and the cost they pay, because the cost your generation, my generation is paying now is not that obvious to see, because it hasn't come back yet. But it will. The tax man always cometh. The tax man of the future. Okay, so his model is taken from a breakdown of civil order in the Civil War. Big difference with the classical view of the world and the Christian view of the world is the body politic is an artifice, not natural. You may have heard, but I tell you, this word is in the 1980s and 1990s, it was all over the place. I couldn't escape the use of this word, and the word is social construction. That's just a social construction. And that term was being used by people who want to use their wills to change the world in a way in keeping with their ideological view of reality. And Hobbes, in many ways, is the first person to provide a narrative in which you could see that would work. or that's how he sees the world. I think the world is not a social construction, and I think the idea of the body politic as an artifice is very voluntaristic, which means to say that suggests that Hobbes can simply wipe away history and see the essences of things in their mechanisms and create a model that it'll all work. And I think that's not right. That's not the way human experience is. He sees the state of nature is where he takes his orientation from. His myth is one of war against all. I'm going to leave it here. I'll pick up from this idea of state of nature next week. Have a very happy Easter. Cheers.